the way I look at it, and again, this is a pretty zoomed out rendering, but I think it gets to the kernel of the truth of the matter, is that people are feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the growing biosecurity, biopolitical form of power and management over their lives, which yes does then get anthropomorphized into Klaus form.
It's just so hard written into the way we think politically that I am of this state beneath this flag, speaking the same language as these people, at whatever level of the economic hierarchy. It's us and then it's them. And I think there's nothing more fundamental to how we operate, because it's exactly how we've evolved. Even in a really primitive sense, there's always been the tribe and then the outside.
This is the Panopticast. Conversations at the edge of freedom.
So in recent years, there have been efforts to convince us to accept as normal and humane those methods of control that have always been considered as exceptional and properly inhuman. Nobody is unaware that the exercise of state control over individuals by means of tracking electronic devices, such as credit cards or cellular phones, has reached previously unimaginable proportions. Those who invoke security measures in order to justify these practices should not sway us. Security measures have nothing to do with it. History teaches us how many such practices, initially reserved for foreigners, are soon applied to every citizen alike. What is at stake here is none other than the new and normal biopolitical relation between citizens and the state. I was going to just put one caveat for us to come back to, and this is a kind of criticism of Agamben. I've mentioned it in the past. It's funny how he quotes in that credit cards and cellular phones, which are both sort of private sector, corporate. Now I know the state uses communications, what's the big one in the UK called? The big spying centre, the sort of stuff that Snowden was exposing.
Oh, you mean the
GCHQ?
GCHQ.
Yeah. So I know the state's kind of using communications, but it's funny how, credit card data is probably for business, for corporate information predominantly, although again the state accesses it. But certainly the whole surveillance capitalism thing with Facebook, it's all about data mining for capital to kind of use that in order to better anticipate people's behaviours and so on. So I do think
for now, for capital to use it.
What? Yeah.
I think it's especially given what we've seen in the last couple of years, it's not going to be hard for that to instantly just become.
And that is available, yeah. They talk about the backdoor. Again, I think that was part of the Snowden revelations about the way in which they were just giving backdoors to government agencies without even the need for a court subpoena or whatever you'd call it in order to access data. So yeah, the two things are totally in cooperation at the very least. But the driving force, I guess, for the infrastructure and so on is through, it's kind of private sector rather than the state.
So the corporate world and the state working really closely together. There's a name for that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But your point, when I read that out earlier was. Well, go on, say it about the fact that the main enemy.
I think we
the main enemy. Enemy.
I think we referenced it in that one of the last few episodes. That it's at least a solid proposition, and I think it's as close to a political fact as there is. That the citizens within under the local state are of equal or far greater threat when you look historically to any citizens or foreign states, and that any energy directed beyond the borders to secure whatever resources and expansion or whatever is going to be the focus. Not even that it's all the focus. I'd say that the focus on their own citizens is going to be the main focus, and that the way you would expect to see that expressed would be basically to the greatest degree it can be expressed that people will go along with, which is just what you kind of see. Like in each state, it's the state pushes, and then the collective sort of body pushes back, and there's that equilibrium point like we talked about before, which is just common sense that's what would happen, just in sort of power dynamics. But I think it creates a psychological sort of shift, a cognitive shift to look at, to imagine the state viewing it's. I think we all operate on a kind of a assumption. Not even assumption. It's just so hard written into the way we think politically that I am of this state beneath this flag. Speaking the same language as these people, at whatever level of the economic hierarchy, it's us and then it's them, and I think there's nothing more fundamental to how we operate, because it's exactly how we've evolved. Even in a really primitive sense, there's always been the tribe and then the outside, so it makes sense that this is a really simple way that people can be operating an unhelpful program, basically, in our assumptions about where power resides and in what proportions geographically, right? So I think it's an assumption we all make, and there's just no basis to make that assumption. It's kind of like the Marxist thing of the top 5% in every country. That's one nation, and then the other 95% across the entire planet, that's the other group, and that's in the most simplest way possible. Of course that's true anyway, which is one of the strongest points about the general sort of Marxist reading of history. So it's kind of obvious, and it's demonstrable. It's there. It's in the evidence of your experiences that's how sort of things are. So, even still, just taking that as evidence that it's a proposition we could probably consider, and as soon as you consider it that way, so many things that are done to the local citizens that you would easily find. It's a little bit like the false flag thing, right? So using whatever someone's position is on the historical fact or fiction of Pearl Harbor being known about and allowed to happen in order to achieve a geostrategic benefit and being able to get into the war and blah blah blah. Forget about whether that's a fact or not. The ability for you to even comprehend that as a possibility shifts radically if you're viewing this sort of realpolitik sort of view of a state's own citizens as being, a utility within the geopolitical game. Whereas if you see it as, it's that thing of, we wouldn't do that to our own people. And it's like, why wouldn't we?
Yeah.
It's the same thing if you'll kill 2,000 people charging over a front line in Normandy to secure some territory in order to save 10,000 citizens at home in the long game, or expand your resources or whatever, then why wouldn't you allow the same thing to happen on your own soil? And I think we've just got this break that says, no, there's one and there's the other. So I think, and that does, that sort of connects to that. That's what I was talking about.
Yeah. So I guess a slightly different lens on the same thing is, and in a way, I think why people are more accepting of some of these changes. The increased surveillance, the increased kind of population management, in relation to the constant social production of threats. And the constant social productions of insecurity and anxiety, and what is ultimately, for most people in Western countries, the most secure situation that Homo sapiens ever found itself in the history of its evolution. Putting aside psychological harms, because we live in a much more
which is literally the flip side to that.
Yeah.
It is the yin and yang.
But that's not usually that's not what's being secured against. They're not out like kind of, in a way it might be good if they were, if that was the target of the harms. And it, to some extent at a superficial and sort of reactive level, it is when you look at things like, the effort to try and instill mental health and mental well-being and so on, but that's kind of trying to plaster over.
But you would agree that the sphere, a huge sphere of this is, fear, generating fear in the society in order to make people malleable, and that relates to use that to go back to that analogy, not the analogy again, but the parallel, the way that in Vietnam, as an absolute historical fact, they flew helicopters over the top of soldiers, over the top of Vietnamese, with loudspeakers playing eerie sounds of spirits, because they knew they could basically manipulate these people who had a belief in these spirits, and they literally, it's psychological warfare, right? Generating fear in order to destabilize these people that we're at war with.
Yeah.
In a really similar way. I'm not even saying it happens. I'm saying it's kind of stupid if it doesn't happen. Like, if for fear to not be generated, in order to make a population more malleable, assuming that is what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
If you don't do it, then you kind of you're not got your Machiavelli down, really, have you? Not,
Well, I mean, I occasionally think about that quote that we mused over a long time ago from the Where Are We Now Agamben book, his sort of writings on the pandemic, where he gets pulled up on the word conspiracy. Do you remember? And he says something like, it's not necessarily an objective conspiracy, but a subjective one, or was it the other way around? Anyway, whatever it was, it was not, it was not clear, the language, and maybe it was to do with the translation, or maybe it was purposely kind of obscure.
And was he getting it? Was he getting it? It's not 10 people smoking cigars around the table, but you can still end up with the same result from.
Well, I think one of the things
pragmatic.
Well, one of the maybe forms of rationality of governance. So when I read something a bit later that he'd written, like Drawing on Foucault, which was to point out, I might have already said this, but to point out that there was. The physiocrats in, again, the 18th century.
What's a physiocrat?
Well, I think they were a group of people that were essentially political economists of their time, and it's a form of it was a form of, I think, mercantilist sort of. I might have this wrong. I'll check afterwards, but they were an influential intellectual force. Let's just say that,
right.
and I think they were state advisors and so on. And they talked about the fact that they tried to prevent, there'd been efforts to prevent famines, there'd been efforts to prevent other sort of disasters, and they'd come to the conclusion that actually it's better not to try to do that, and instead prepare to manage the effects of these things and to guide those effects in a direction that is, amenable to state interests, I guess. But you could say you might be able to stretch that and try and argue some group or population within a state. And so it's this kind of rationality of security whereby it's constantly trying to operate on effects, and so there's a kind of secret complicity in the development of crises and threats, broadly speaking, because that's its modus operandi, and so I think what he was saying is, it doesn't have to be a direct conspiracy, but there is something about the very logic of this type of governance that is becoming more dominant.
Well, and the the moral imperative, I think we've sort of mentioned this 2 or 3 times from different sort of angles, but something that starts out as effectively triage or whatever, like a state looking at a set of circumstances and mitigating harm, saying, oh, well, we'll let this burn in order for these people to survive or whatever, because that's just triage. That happens. You let someone die in order to save 2 people or whatever. And that's going on, politically, economically, in terms of, like whatever, poverty and whatnot, that's going on all the time. We're moving resources around to save the maximum amount of people.
Make, live and let die. Yeah, who's getting left to die?
Yeah. That's going on all the time. At some point, within the insane sea of spheres of that happening, how many circumstances are going to arise where by doing something, crossing the line into where someone would accept that you let the guy in the car crash die to save the other guy who's bleeding less or whatever, right? That's easy. It's very easy to get across to someone. But then saying we're going to let these 3,000 people die at Pearl Harbor, to use the extreme case, no one would be down for that. But from the pragmatic position of the state, in terms of what's its objective, even if you're not cynical, even if you believe its objective is completely, if it's got this deep felt instinctive love for its people, even then it's to save the maximum amount of people and to allow and propel the continuance of the culture and its way of life and the precepts of that civilization. So to achieve all of its goals, it would definitely be rationally compelled, to cross a line that a citizen would never be down for morally, but the state has no reason and nothing hindering it, no reason not to do it and nothing hindering it from doing it, to do that. To believe that never happens, that we never go into that zone in any way, in any country, is hopelessly naive. What is it that is engineering that is maintaining that naive position?
And I couldn't find the direct quotes, but when I was reading about the rationalizations given by the US government executive branch during the whole Abu Ghraib and these reclassification of people and the where the president could actually assassinate US citizens eventually, if they were deemed to be a threat to national security without any kind of due process or procedure. There were kind of legal scholars literally making the argument that the president can't do anything illegal. I mean, he's the executive in chief or
commander in chief.
Commander in chief, sorry. And so when
That's
they're saying
the
these,
right there.
well, exactly, of course it is. So when they're saying these things, you're like, they're not even hiding this, right? They're not. They believe philosophically, Schmittianly, or whatever. That this is how constitutionalism works, and this is how the kind of this is how the system works. It's
a shift, though, right? Like there's what can be said in a given era, and then what can be said 20 years later, and we can be softened up for that. Everything, the Iraq War, everything that people have gone through for the last 20 or 30 years has definitely created a readiness to accept things we would have never accepted. And it's that boiling frog or slippery slope thing we were kind of talking about in other contexts. The more people move towards a certain it's like it's the textbook quote of I can't remember where I read it, but there's someone actually talked about it. A German citizen talked about how someone said, that kind of textbook question of how did it happen? How did this happen? And you had this reasonable person who is terrifyingly just like us and just like your grandparent kind of thing, saying it happened slowly. Yeah. It started with commentary that was now acceptable, that wasn't acceptable, or Jewish people own more of the property around it than anybody else, and it starts with a sensible economic fact, and then slowly, unbelievably, over a given period, ends up with Jews being dragged out of houses and put onto, and people in there, it's not a matter of, oh, I don't give a shit. It's a matter of, well, I've just done this other thing. This is yesterday. I let this happen. The day before, and so that it becomes as inconceivable as it could be. Yeah. Watching a Jew get dragged onto a cart to be taken somewhere, and they didn't actually know exactly what was going on, but just the fact of someone being dragged onto a cart. When the day before you've turned away while a Jew got beaten up for saying, no, I refuse to go back in my house, so that seems logical. You can't argue with the state. All these ways that are sensible slowly end up with you being a Nazi in that period. Yeah. And it's something almost every one of us, basically everyone that doesn't, I keep coming back to the values thing, everyone that doesn't go, no, my values, and refuse at the absolute moment that line's crossed, everyone else is susceptible to that slow, progressive kind of shift, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I won't do it justice, probably. There's a few things I want to say, but I didn't read the whole books. I bought quite a lot of books recently to try and mine the bits that I needed. But there was a book written from a kind of ethnographic anthropological lens called From Righteousness to the Far Right, and I think it was Sweden. I might be getting this wrong, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. I'll try and sort of make the core point. It was a I think it was Sweden, and their whole like narrative and how they were considered was the most tolerant and liberal towards
When is this?
refugees, like sort of
Really?
Brexit period, like
Yeah.
4 years ago, just before the Syrian
Yeah.
refugee crisis. And what he's trying to do, and it's an academic trend, I guess, that's been going, is to say we constantly see things from most say international relations and security studies and those disciplines that have grown out of looking at state power, looking at how the international world order works, looking at how geopolitics works, and so on. Have their main unit of analysis as these big institution states, but then also others in a kind of more globalized world with et cetera, et cetera. And there's been a kind of push to try to actually dismantle maybe even ontologically like these different scales, that there's this scale and then there's this scale and then there's this scale. And so you get a lot of work that's talking about the way in which security, it talks about security practices and how it plays out in everyday lives, and how how the kind of geopolitical and the personal and the everyday are in a real kind of complex and meshed relationship, and it's not as simple to sort of say, oh, there's something happening at this scale and then there's something happening at this scale, and mainly what's happening here is being imposed onto a kind of given population. So anyway, without all the nuance and sort of power and really quite it's a really sort of it was quite a trailblazing approach. He was just an embedded ethnographer in these communities where they transitioned from being very righteous towards the rights and of refugees to all sorts of lines being crossed, taboos being generated, positions being took that would never have been taken before. And then that provide there is a sense in which the media and the state and all those things that you see up there are kind of responding to sort of population dynamics. So it just kind of links to the point that you were making around how did this happen and what was being accepted. And I guess in the case of the Third Reich, it's predominantly there probably is a lot more truth in the fact that was more of a top-down imposed ideology, but it won't have just been that. It can't be as simple as that, and it wasn't. No, and it won't have been. It won't have been. Just the majority of citizens, being influenced behind the backs or whatever, or propagandized or whatever into something. There will have been all those kind of small changes at the micro political level, at the level of what Foucault called microphysics, that enabled that.
And probably the really fruitful area for analysis, by far the most fruitful, because it's pointing it back at yourselves, is this whole thing of like, the degree. So let's say there's two pressures there. There's the slow creeping circumstantial change that makes an individual citizen totalitarian in what they'll accept, and then let's say there is like a lesser but extant direct pressure of some kind for the world that we're gonna become Third Reich. The cultural assumption from our side is that that the balance was tipped one way rather than the other, because we don't want to accept that this slow creeping change could take place, because we're just as susceptible to that. It's easy to be like
culpable,
and it's easy to know that, it's easy to be able to say to yourself, if the state suddenly started doing that to Jews around here, it's really easy to write on it. I mean, even in that situation, I don't have a huge amount of faith in humanity in general to respond adversely in the numbers we think they would. But leaving that aside, it's a lot more of a difficult it's a lot more difficult terrain to imagine yourself being taken along here the way they would be there, and it all comes back to that, and it's getting a bit more popular. I like that it's becoming more of a popular discussion point from a lot of different people in different ways, that we're no different, and it wouldn't have been any different here at all, maybe even worse actually, because they were, if you think of the just phenomenal intellectual sphere. I mean, but I don't know. You could point to the same thing in Britain, I suppose. But Germany is a sort of a tower of rational thinking, and do you know what I mean? I mean, then
Well,
again,
yeah.
I suppose that it's been pointed to that can be the downfall. Like you can suddenly become a lot more righteous and committed to the conclusions you've reached on a rational basis, kind of thing. So I suppose that's not a particularly.
But
strong point.
not only that. I mean, and I don't know whether I believe this or not, but I think it's a plausible proposition to make. If you think about the kind of philosophers and the dominant intellects in, say, the UK versus Germany
At the time.
At the time and sort of just prior to
trends.
the kind of lineage, if you like, of and that lineage is no doubt, I mean, I'm sure it's based on all sorts of historical and cultural factors, where those different nations were in terms of ascendancy and what ideologies therefore buttressed the kind of the geopolitics that would be consistent with those interests and all the rest of it. I mean, I just don't know. But in England, Marx was here, but he was German. John Stuart Mill, a classical liberal, had certain socialist sort of tendencies, but a classical liberal, or certainly very liberal. I mean, John Locke, and then all those associated with the Scottish Enlightenment, Adam Smith, forget the David Hume, etc. And they are in a way the philosophers of our elites as well. When they study PPE and whatever came before that. When they go to the grand private schools and sort of, so. And then looking, I guess, at the English working class. The kind of Thomson, E.P. Thomson kind of. He wrote the history of the English working class, and he starts out with a really well known, I guess, in certain circles. A couple of lines, which is basically to say he wants to give what does he call them now? It's these different trades from the time that were dominant. I can't remember. It might have been the carpenter and the etc. As actual agents and voices of history, because he was critiquing the Marxist tradition that its structures and its people that are representatives of the social structures, whether they're workers or whether they're the capitalists, etc. So he was trying to insert agency back in. But anyway, point being is there will be certain cultural things that may make nations more or less predisposed, both from their elites
and a given time
and
as
from
well,
their
given period.
Yeah, a given period
And
that
it's
does
probably
have some
true to say that
continuity.
there'd be some ostensibly virtuous and like the critical thinking thing again, the rationalist thing again. There'll be some apparently ostensibly virtuous character traits of a society that in the wrong circumstances are the exact thing that can be turned into a negative.
Yeah.
And in a similar way, like a general it's a little bit like that quote that's been topical lately, but the abrasiveness, someone being abrasive and firm to a point that could be difficult to contend with, is the first person to stand up for the appropriate thing, whereas a passive and submissive populace, which is nice in certain circumstances, if everyone was like that, including the state structure, that would be great.
To get along, yeah.
But that can end up being the thing that allows the worst evils to sort of occur. Was there an English version of like Schmidt? Was there? Because there is. You get Schmidt and you get Heidegger. You get people there are ideas embedded in what they're saying. Not obviously with Heidegger, it's a little bit more vague, but with someone like Schmidt, it does look like there are these. I mean, he's only saying what everyone says now. I suppose everyone in or someone.
Well, if you go back to what I was saying about the US.
Yeah. So was that? Yeah, was there a British equivalent or an English equivalent? Or...
Not that I know of. But then again, I guess people become more well known given sort of historical context that then. But not that I know of.
Yeah, that's so important, right? Like that, Schmidt ends up being someone to point to in the context of his nationality. Someone equivalent here.
Might have just had no influence,
no platform,
ideas.
No platform, that absolute, and even the people who are acting, who are functionally kind of the same as, you know, like the parallel. It's not a radical parallel to hold Churchill and to hold Hitler. Yes, it's different, but the effects, the direct effects of being able to, you know, marshal an entire country, like Dresden or whatever else, there are stains on Churchill's record that stand right side by side with a lot of what Hitler did. But
and many of which, even if, you know, many of which were well before the war.
Yeah.
I mean, the way, you know, people balk at it, but, you know, and I know people go, yeah, but it was the context of the time. But Churchill was, this is my understanding, was, you know, more racist than the normal person, right? Was willing to
what's the line?
willing to commit atrocities on colonial people. Use
veiled.
Emergent chemical warfare. You know, the stuff that we would be looking at Assad and saying, look what he's done. Look at that. We need to, you know.
And it's so, I think it's displayed in that quote about Palestinians. It's along the lines of I'm not prepared to accept. I wouldn't accept the rights of the Palestinian I wouldn't accept the rights of a dog to own the baby's crib as a result of it, you know, like it stepping into that crib in advance of the baby or something like that. And he references Palestinians with a dog to the baby and the Jewish people.
Yeah, exactly. But so just going back to the kind of the original thing around the imposition of control measures to a domestic population that had previously been used for, you know, controlling the inflow of foreign populations or for criminal populations or whatever. I think, like, you know, people accept it in a sense because, you know, going back to that kind of, you know, bare life point, if, you know, I've said this before, but if, like, just maintaining a healthy, long life, being able to, you know, care for your family within modern society with everything that it brings, you know.
Important to say that all these things you're listing are the absolute core drives, consciously and subconsciously, that we've got.
People, yeah. And, you know, the gas is still flowing and Netflix is still flowing, and, you know, family life in that you know, mythic form is okay. Or even if it's not, even if, like, which is I think the sort of experience we're living through now, it just seems like things are getting notched up, and, like, there's a lot of there's pressure on this. We need to consider ourselves really lucky. We need to defend. You know, it's like, you know, the title of that Foucault book, Society Must Be Defended, and so. Yeah, anything that is then imposed in those ways, there's just likely to be less pushback, and in a way, I guess what I also question, and I believe both sides of it, and I'm sure sometimes one element of it is more prevalent than the other, but it comes back to that point around irrationality, you know, a form of governmentality, which is, you know, again the word Foucault used for how different rationalities of governing people become more or less predominant and have evolved over time. You know, it may be that we just kind of under the sway of that particular sort of biopolitical governmentality, where precisely the kind of thing that Agamben's pointing to and being you know, hugely concerned about is, you know, what the population, or at least large parts of it, want in order to feel increasingly safe, you know, because, you know, it's increasingly safe to protect that status quo maintenance, that current existence they've got. And in a way, like, the state's providing what people want. We will secure you more. And it comes to that. It comes back to that kind of, like you said when you just interrupted me and said, you know, let's not forget that's kind of the conscious and subconscious drives.
They provide you the needs that you're screaming for.
Yeah,
but then facilitating those needs more.
Yeah, but you don't necessarily. I guess what I'm saying is you don't necessarily have to be like, when you reference sort of Machiavelli or whatever, like I'm sure some of that is going on, well, I know, well, obviously some of it's going on. I think it's difficult to pinpoint, how much in which context.
And how,
I think
how willful it is versus how automated it can be,
yeah, exactly. But yeah, that's definitely kind of one of the kind of great malaises and great challenges, and it sort of links into what you were saying about, how does this happen to us, after, comparing to the kind of German experience, and it's like, I think that's why Agamben's trying to kind of sound the alarm bells. It's like, do you realise the nature of the, do you realise, he takes the extreme examples, and he uses a method, that's about paradigms. He was criticised for not providing enough historical context or nuance, and he said, I'm not a historian. He said, what I do is, basically what he does in this approach, and at that point he clarified sort of methodologically what it was he was doing and what he was saying, because he was excoriated for saying the camp is the new nomos of the world.
The refugee camp.
Well, the camp as a paradigm. So in its most extreme form, the extermination camps. You've got refugee camps, but you've increasingly got within a surveillance state. I mean, within a structure whereby every aspect of your movement, the facial recognition technology, the digital surveillance, potentially the kind of more forms of biological surveillance and so on. What he's trying to say is this is antithetical with the notion of citizenship and what the Greeks understood the polis to be, and at least the myths that we have, that we tell ourselves about, about the political order. Those what we're describing here and what we're seeing and what's becoming increasingly predominant are the conditions of the camp. At any moment, if you to then take the kind of extent to which exceptions can be made and executive sort of power, not just within the executive in a way, but the more things like, look at what happened.
What is it, just for clarity? Like, so what is this? What is the camp in this example? What is it expressing? It's an externalized,
So within the camp, I guess, in its extreme form, people were completely. If you go back to that Bios and Zoe thing, so there's the realm of necessity and depoliticization, which is about maintaining survival. It's about survival, but basically it's about the realm of necessity and the realm of survival and the sustenance of the material body, physical body, and the maintenance of life in that sense, in terms of the maintenance of our physiological.
So is the camp being it's being used to express the idea that it's the epitome of the efficient model in which the largest amount of biological material is being fed, maintained, and is politically is a political utility. Is it that, or is it? I'm just struggling to see what's the general camp thing. Well, if you said the refugee camp is the new whatever, I'd be like, all right, I get that. The sort of state of the exception being applied to those people.
Well, that's it in a way. I mean, so he's saying, if the exception becomes the norm, we're essentially living in camp conditions because the protections of law, the protections of constitutionalism, are removed, and and what we see, and even not in the most, if you like, extreme cases where an exception is actually declared. And emergency powers revoked, consistently, like we've talked about before, there are more routine indications of that, like when I've said that, for example, most of what happened in COVID was done under the Public Health Act that was passed in 1984. That is Parliament saying, there you go, executive. Okay, we passed the law, but it's so broad, and you can create so much secondary legislation that essentially, we're saying to the executive that they can effectively govern, through the management of effects rather, and that's where the kind of immediacy of governance and the executive to act on the specifics rather than the general of the law. So the general of the law provides a certain framework in which everyone must live. It's saying don't do this. Don't do this. It's what Foucault's talking about in terms of sovereign power and juridical power. It prohibits, and up to the extreme end, it kills if people don't follow those laws. At the extreme end of that, and it incarcerates and so on. But a positive sort of form of power is constantly trying to act on a population that's rendered kind of an object of its will. And so I guess the camp and so the extreme form of that is in a way the state of exception, whereby the juridical norms are jettisoned completely, and it's a pure sort of executive power, if you like, acting on a population. And in a way that's the camp, because then it's at complete discretion. And I remember listening to a guy who was sort of explaining it, and in these terms, that it's like now when after 9/11, when you go to airports, and the way you kind of managed you're under suspicion irrespective of any just cause for that suspicion. There is no just cause, but you're in an environment in which you're under suspicion. Your passport gets taken off you by men with guns, and I mean, I don't know if you've ever felt it, but you kind of feel
in the first few years, especially.
Yeah, you kind of feel like you're in that liminal space whereby your citizenship and the kind of protections that you think you have, could be taken away from you.
And to reference that boiling frog thing, the slippery slope thing, if you like, the thing that always struck me about that airport experience, during and after, is the theatricality of it. Like, I remember a few stories, but this is a good one. I remember taking a bag through that I was travelling at the time, and I just had everything stuffed into this rucksack. And when I say everything, I had like a laptop, a camera, a little PSP. I just had loads and loads of pieces of electronic stuff with a charger for each of them. And it would basically a rucksack this big, stuffed full of wires and electrical shit. And this is the time when anything electrical has to go into the tray kind of thing, right?
So I've got that. Four trays to get through.
So I've got that, and I've got my rucksack. And there's a massive queue. People are all held up, and it's like they're tough shit, As soon as it started to get a bit, it had got delayed to a certain point. I am in this situation anyway, and they're getting everyone to empty their electrical stuff, right? And then they get to my rucksack. I take my rucksack out. He opens the bag. He doesn't even have to look at someone to get squared about it. Just looks in and just goes, shuts it, and passes it to me, because it's too much work. It's going to cause too much of a delay.
Yeah.
So, and like in the circumstances of trying to stop a terrorist from there could be a bomb in there, right? In that situation, you can't just let one person through, otherwise the whole thing's a waste of time. That in itself just proved the total theatricality of the situation. It is there to provide a theatre which, from the way it was understood from the man on the ground, the men and women on the ground situation, is that we're creating a presence that would, intimidate someone who's in that situation. But you can't avoid the fact that the actual thing itself was a meaningless theatre in order to achieve possibly a legitimate, anti-terrorist, to pressure them. But there were definitely that theatre to it. And when you combine that with what you were talking about in terms of just that sensation, just that how it feels to be in that arrangement, it was surreal. And those two things combined, you definitely get the sense of being managed on both of those levels. And I think that's what that sense is. You're being managed in the there are men with guns sense, and that's just uncomfortable. And then you're being managed in the some of this is fake. There is definitely some duplicitousness to this. There's some artificiality. And I think that's what's so unnerving. Guns combined with I'm being lied to on some level is a horrible, an horrible sort of psychological space to be in.
Yeah. And think about, I mean, in a way this is, what the biosecurity thing, which is, I think, he didn't coin the phrase, but he used it in a different way to how it's commonly being used. I mean, I think when he was saying, from a right to health to an obligation to be healthy, but, we just totally take it for granted now. But, with the most surveilled population, I think in London, there's the most CCTV cameras per square meter than the whole of the world. That
it's
includes
more-
China.
It's more than China.
I believe so. I've read that. Maybe, I'm sure, the league tables are shifting, but
And that has to be a metric.
is that the Greek Agora or is that the prison?
Yeah.
Is that a place where, if you think about the biopolitical tattooing, the markings of our body, it's our bodies, not our sort of, if you like, political identities, not our political and social identities, in which we kind of enter into the social and political realm and engage in as citizens in the governance of our country. We're increasingly being rendered more and more like ants in a population that are being managed. And managed not only through these state sort of state driven kind of security concerns in that respect, but in the way in which I was reading recently, and the kind of transhumanist thing, and that's kind of taken off or has become a motif in some areas of what sort of resistance movements around the whole COVID situation. And you think, what is this? And I think the mainstream interpretation is, it's just because these people latch on to any old conspiracy theory, and they just they've just got a paranoid mind. And of course,
transhumanism as the core thing of the fusion with technology type of thing. It's basically realistic cyborgs. People incorporating more and more technology into themselves, chips and whatnot. And which we're doing. That's happening. It's always going to happen. Of course, we've always been a bit fused with technology, and we're going to get more and more fused with it as it advances.
It's
for our own benefit, not because we're being chipped by Bill Gates. We're going to want to do it.
But this is the point, right? Around the hugely depoliticizing nature of a biopolitical order, and this is what Agamben's getting at. That is again not the space of popular sovereignty is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. So I think you can look at a lot of things, and I know this is totally sort of low rendering, but you can look at, say, Brexit, or all these, or the election of Trump, or all these examples of where in one way or another these are often just votes against the establishment, votes against the elite. What does the elite want, and how is the mob gonna just stick the thumbs at them or whatever so. But that's and I've listened to a lot of people talk about our rights and our democracy and freedom, and all these things mean something very, very different when you kind of recognize that whether in every detail Agamben's right, but just the general premise of that he's not the only one to say it, of course. I mean, Foucault said it as well, and many others, that we live in biopolitical societies and power operates very, very differently, and it operates in a technocratic way from all sorts of things, from kind of the power of medical science, the power of public health, and some of it may be good, like it's not a total you can't just make a kind of generalized sort of making live can be a good thing, trying to protect people, trying to kind of create systems that do undermine insecurities, that do address threats to populations. I mean, you can't just say that's an out and out bad. It's just that arguably it's become pathological, and also it's become
more of a tactic of controlling people than it is protecting them.
And it's become captured by both corporate interests in terms of the surveillance capitalism that we were talking about, in terms of data harvesting, in terms of the transhumanism. That is a kind of, so I was reading an article by I think UK based professor, and again it's saying things that wouldn't be at all unusual to think from our perspective, and he did caveat it at the start, saying this is not a conspiracy thing. And it isn't, right? It doesn't have to be. And it's like I said before, just because some of these people like mythologize it in those terms, whether they even believe that myth or not, it's providing a rendering that allows them to act in the world.
And and to explain things that they see.
And that are real.
Which is what a myth is for.
Yeah, and that are real. So
and it's kind of vital to throw in there that, like, someone could have a conspiratorial myth, if you like, that helps them to understand how power could be operating in their environment. The reality that lies behind that myth could be like kind of my go-to, like the conspiracy of nature kind of thing. I don't trust people yet. I don't trust human beings. Like we're not. In no way do I see any evidence that we should be trusted. We should be loved and we should be cared for and we should have our trauma healed. But generally speaking, I'm very cynical about what a typical person will do if they get an opportunity to have power over people, unless they're in a very, very ongoing self-analytical dialogue about it, right? Well, that's all you need for a conspiracy. If you take it as even a possibility that all of mankind has a percentage of darkness and power, need for power in them, trauma-based need for power, well, you only need to any system. Then your problem is any concentrated influence. As soon as if there's a system that allows influence to manifest and be sort of focused, the people within that system will do what I suspect they would do, and you will get all of the political end results that a conspiracy theorist is pointing at, and maybe saying it's the lizards or whatever their own particular thing is, but it's all completely explainable just by shitty people, people that haven't quite got to true humanity yet. Like we all act like we're human, talk like we're humans, and call each other humans, but we're kind of like monkey humans. Gandhi and a few people have got there, but the majority of us are really not at a good point on this scale kind of thing. So I think that's an important, like what lies behind all those myths could be something extremely simple and not conspiratorial in any way, just that humans haven't quite evolved to the point they should have evolved to yet, and that would stand as a perfectly sensible reality to be behind those myths.
And as well, I mean, it's systemic and complex, and people are playing roles in cogs, even where those roles might be some of the bigger cogs, than the average person. This kind of, this article that I was reading was basically saying that COVID has provided a context. He sort of references the Naomi Klein thing around, capitalizing on crisis, for the transhumanist agenda, which is composed of all sorts of different groups from, sort of scientists, social engineers, forms of capital. Elon Musk's a kind of, key example, with the, what's his program called about? They have already put chips in and so on. And so
it's the answer to everything. It's everything we've got with the environmental crisis, whatever you believe about that, all the different things that are happening. It's therefore transhumanism, or therefore technocracy, and then the two things, kind of fused.
And so and in a way, and all of that is going on. Where's the popular sovereignty? Where is the Greek agora? Where is any of the things where you would expect people to want to sort of make collective decisions through dialogue and reflection on their lives now? And I just think there's two levels to that. One is the economy, and in a way, Foucault, fully recognised this. Political economy was one of the dominant sciences that was driving state reason around making live as opposed to the right to death or the right to kill. So, it's totally the fact that and Hannah Arendt was saying this as well in Non-Violence, it's totally the fact that a sort of alliance between a depoliticised economy and a depoliticised form of scientific expertise and the march of technology and all that is creating a situation that is, I think, dystopian, and I think many people would if they were asked to reflect, but it's just happening irrespective of that.
It can't help but be the rebirth, like that whole, what we would loosely there put forward, the transhumanism, technocracy. It's all just it's a hyper rational and easy to put forward as the next evolution in the political state of affairs, but it's basically a return to survival of the fittest. It's survival of the fittest within an economic sphere, survival of the fittest within the intellectual sphere. It's the people who dominate within the state, the circumstances we found ourselves in, socio-political reality that we're in, the people who are the towering leaders in those fields, the Musks and the people like that. all power is getting centralized within that transhumanist sort of technocratic idea. Power is emerging in the corporate sphere and all the rest of it in all these places that if, maybe it won't, but if that's what ends up happening, we end up with a technocratic state of affairs. We've just gone back to, the monkey that had the biggest stick used to be the patriarch, and we're in a situation where the guy with, like the Musk, the person with a radically, not necessarily a broad encompassing human nature, just someone who mastered a kind of actually inherently corrupt sphere of human interactions, like the sort of corporate world, or
and even our own complicity, even the popular, so it got, that Paul King's Northwood, thing about the machine and where's the line. I mean, and where, we want to talk about solutions as well at a certain point. I really think, and it's becoming more popular again, and I'm sure there's many other groups, but, again, in a lot of people's awakening around the COVID thing, I think, however imperfectly and however, gropingly, it's been that kind of nightmare that's been creeping into people's sleep. It's been that thing that's been there in the background, but it's never had a moment where it's, the sort of boiling frog thing where it's moved quickly enough for people to kind of galvanize around it. And I think, as I said, like, commentators are looking at that and going, oh, it's because they're paranoid, it's because they'll just take any sort of conspiracy that's sort of thrown out there. And it's like, no, like, yeah, there may be some muddled thinking, in certain regards. There may be, but, what they're viscerally going against. And this is why it's, freeman of the land sort of stuff in the same way. This is why, we need to take our democracy back. It's the same reason why, moving away from medical tyranny, and we need to like get into well-being and so on. Again, the commentators go, oh, this is because, that conspirituality thing. This is because, people with these spiritual views are more inclined towards, conspiracy theories and so on. The way I look at it, and again, this is a pretty zoomed out rendering, but I think it gets to the kernel of the truth of the matter, is that people are feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the growing biosecurity, biopolitical form of power and management over their lives, which, yes, does then get anthropomorphized into Klaus Schwab, because he is the spokesperson. He is one of the spokespeople.
One of the things you could point to.
It does get, with Elon Musk, because again, he is one of the spokespeople for it. It doesn't mean he's kind of sat there like, playing all the the chess piece and moving it all around the board. He's just, or him, those institutions, etc., are just, pushing the fourth industrial revolution and so on.
And it's really only it's viscerally felt by people as all they're feeling is a decrease in sovereignty. It's like they don't even need an intellectual space for it. They just need to be, I'm not happy with how things are going. And if you ask them what it is they don't like, a lot of people wouldn't be able to put it into words, but they viscerally feel that their sovereignty is being slowly undermined. Yeah. And even if you don't have the free intellectual political framework to discuss it or the historical examples, everyone feels it, because there's nothing more primal, there's nothing more basic than I'm not in control of my destiny. Yeah. And then the demonstration, the obvious demonstration in your environment that somebody else is in control of my reality. It's not just that I'm displaced, it's that I'm being steered, and I can even see who's steering me, the technologies that are doing it, whatever.
Yeah. So there's a really good, it's probably quite long, but I will find it again and bring it, because I'm not going to be able to do justice to it now. Maybe we'll use it as a quote to kick off next time.
Yeah, be a good one.
But it's about, like, if you go back to that risk and uncertainty environment, and you go to that kind of notion of securitization, and the thing about what Agamben said about the objective versus subjective conspiracy or whatever. Yeah. This guy was, one of the ways this guy was articulating how, in a way, it's incompatible, not only with sort of politics properly understood and democracy, but as you were saying, in terms of like individual sovereignty. And what he was saying, I think, in a nutshell, was that the kind of model of human agency that underpinned, let's say, sovereign power and or the sort of juridical political realm, was one in which people are treated as agents with volition that then is the basis of a social and political order. In a security paradigm, which is the same as biopolitical, like I said at the start, security in its broadest sense, which includes the hard security of, and it also includes the securitization of financial markets. It moves into this space of uncertainty and risk. And so the depoliticization is linked to something, it's linked to the kind of, I don't know how to put it, I don't want to sound pompous or whatever, but it's linked to a kind of a social ontology or something of what people are, because it's a kind of framework that just doesn't coincide with personal sovereignty. We changed into a kind of field, we're almost changed into some kind of field of, statistical risk and
it's like the apotheosis of collectivism's worst nightmare. Like you've gone from having it shows you how religion played a powerful role. Like that idea, that concept of someone being a free will agent kind of thing. You couldn't have anything other than that in a Christian society.
Yeah.
Like that's at the absolute core of it. When that's gone and people end up being biopolitical units whose role and not just purpose, but their duty is to the other units within the system. It's like it's pushing it away from that agency to something that's very easy to just so that people can end up perceiving themselves as it's like the Borg thing, you know what I mean? People can end up perceiving themselves as being way less important on an individual basis.
Absolutely.
Than you ever would have before.
And the quote, I'll show you it, but the quote that started my proposal with, I don't know if I deleted in the end. I might have done because I run out of words, but I shouldn't have done.
You ran out of words?
I ran out of words.
Space to say everything you wanted to say.
I might again get this slightly wrong, but it was a Foucault quote again. It said something like, those that are resisting power need not, it's not sufficient to call out violence of the institutions, nor is it sufficient to blame reason. What needs to be focused on are particular rationalities. And so this is what is always, been looking at, like, how do these
as in
truth regimes? Let me link it to what I said.
Things that people
to like, if you impose, the model of biopolitics, the model of risk and securitization based on this kind of force field of interlinked parts within a kind of uncertain environment, like the unknown unknowns and all the rest of it, you are fundamentally changing the ontological status of the human being. And you're not necessarily doing it because you're a Stalin or a Hitler or whatever, and it's about, so I think this probably, like, I'm only sort of thinking this off the top of my head now, but this probably links to the, the Agamben point about the secret, this what he refers to, but the secret link between modern liberal constitutional democracies and totalitarian societies, because again it's a form of rationality and it may be operating under a different.
What's the link?
Well, the fact that most I would say most people are like, okay, this is about the liberal, the John Stuart Mills and versus the Marxes or the whoever's, the collectivist versus the individualist. And I guess, what Nazism was a coming together, a fusing of a form of biopolitical power with sovereign power in its most extreme elements. So the right to kill, the sovereign right to kill, with the biopolitical make live. And it's Peterson talks about it, doesn't it, how like disease occupied their minds completely. The Volk, the people, that this was about protecting the people. And I don't think it was just an ideology. I don't think it was just we'll pretend that's what it is, but really we're kind of doing this. I think, and the whole eugenics thing behind it, right? So it's not to say these things, it's not to make sort of facile comparisons, but, I think at that very fundamental level where, like you said, with the Christian tradition, certainly Protestantism, the individual and individual's will was sort of fundamental, and it's not that that's necessarily, it's not that that's necessarily pointing to ontological truth in a deep sense. It's the fact that different types of rationality, so for example, Protestantism as a mentality creates a kind of view of the human which is about free will and volition. It's not that one is more true or the other in a way, but it's like, what are the power effects and what does it mean for us as a society if the biopolitical rationality dominates? It does mean that popular sovereignty is going to wither, or is going to become rather superficial. It does mean that people's sense of agency and political agency is going to move. It does mean that other types of governance processes are going to come to the fore. And it's not like that's been imposed per se in order to disempower people. It's like all sorts of forces conspire, including modern forms of technology combined with capitalism, which seek to render people and can make profit out of render people data points.
And I think a good sort of an important point to just tag on there is what matters probably more than anything at this time is that there's been times in history where you can look at hyper collectivist social orders like Spartans or whatever, like you are literally a limb of the tree, and your life is utterly meaningless other than as this part of a collectivist unit. It swings like in different cultures at different times, and in response to other highly mobilized and effective collectivism on your border, the natural response, a little bit like you hear a lot like ours, the West's response to China should be more of a collectivist order kind of thing. So, and if you look at history, it's all over the place, and it does go to these extremes. Like, there's quite an apocalyptic way this stuff's talked about, as if we're moving on there's a historical, and I think there is a historical trajectory in the last 100 years towards greater and greater collectivism. I think it's the single political pattern in the West. But in history, that's been all over the place. But what's vital is the reason it's been all over the place is because of individualism of millions of different kinds, and usually empowered by some religious idea or something, has pulled things back from collectivism and into something more individualistic. But we're at the first moment in hundreds of millions of years of evolution where human beings have the capacity to instill a permanent collectivism, like through technology now, and the capacity to control people's minds, but like the capacity to, it is though, isn't it? The technologies of social conditioning now that go on outside of our sphere of awareness, combined with the impositions of technologies that what we know about, there's enough there to do it. And then there's what's going to occur in the next 15 years, right? So it's not just credible, it's almost certain, right, that the capacity, in fact it is certain, the capacity to instill a permanent collectivist order of the global state of affairs is in place now, or is almost about ready to be in place, and will definitely be in place in the next 10 to 15 years. That is a historical moment that's a before and after this thing, where it's always been pulled back from that before, but where within a level of that control does the emergent individualistic enterprise occur that then shakes that up? And maybe it can happen in a way that I can't see, but I don't see how that's not
on the Panopticast.